My name is Urquidi. I'm a senior engineer at Unity Labs. I also specialize in technical art design, UI and UX. Currently working on the Editor VR project. If you haven't used it before, I'd say try it, shameless plug. We are in the beginning of building the tool set that will allow individuals to be able to grab Unity, jump into your HUD, whatever, and begin sculpting worlds. So our first task, of course, is to be able to take the functionality of Unity 3D. Also, if you haven't tried Unity, grab that, try that as well. And be able to begin the process of building worlds, tweaking worlds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Things you've all probably heard at this point. We do have some very cool experimental UX paradigms we're working with now with intuitive and spatial-based UX design. That isn't public right now, but perhaps at another time we can talk about that. That's the more interesting paradigm that's breaking us away from a bit of what I'll actually end up talking about in this talk. There's a lot less of Editor VR and more about the grand scheme of UX in XR. So with that, UX and VR. Probably not going to say VR very often in this. Just going to say XR. What is XR? XR is a relief to anyone who's had to give these talks or work in this industry to a great deal. All the Rs, all the current Rs, virtual augmented mix, AR, MR, the 250 other spin-off devices, the subgenres of R that only mask out or chroma red when it's next to green, et cetera, et cetera. So this niche of a million different Rs to be able to grab market share is interesting, but in the end, quite a bit of UX design is going to be common and shared throughout all these experiences. To be pragmatic, I come with a certain set of biases, but you saw those slides we initially saw at the beginning of this presentation. VR is what it is. I love it as an artist, as a VR fine artist. I like the ability to block out the world, but the limited reach that it's going to have and what it will actually be able to deliver, I think we should be a little pragmatic about that. But when we design for VR UX, we can be mindful of what it's going to turn into. Patents are nice along the way, obviously, but when you're making these choices and I'm making the assumption that the majority of this audience at least has some interest or does some actual UX design, consider, and I'll touch on this at the end, consider that you're in the process of designing the UX language, which is going to be our day-to-day really soon. As soon as the right synergy of the devices that some of us have been able to play with here meets marketing and your moment-to-moment is subsidized and this will replace your smartphone, you'll have played a role in defining this language that will be your 24/7 and everyone's 24/7. Anyway, so XR UX today, please pardon the text-heavy display, had a bunch of images, saw the or the timeline that I was going to have in this situation, cut a bunch of it out and ended up wanting to deliver more of the UX talk that would prevent so many of the broken record situations that we have in our design process and working with other developers and seeing applications that are the stalwarts right now constantly iterate and constantly from version 1 up to version 10 have to make the same changes, have to make the same set of decisions. So this is the talk that coming from that perspective, from a VR dev going back to DK1, I wish I would have heard. And in my opinion would save you quite a bit of time in the long run. So as I said earlier, solve for today and consider the future. You got to make money. We need your product to be able to sell. We need market saturation right now with VR. Cool. Design for XR. But keep that next paradigm in mind. Keep in mind that we're going into a situation where your limited form of input right now and the devices and the means that we're using them, they're going to die very quickly, or at least be phased out to a great degree very quickly as soon as the market can find the excuse to do that. But it doesn't mean we don't have fun today, and it doesn't mean we don't define that language today. So experiential UX is the term we use at Labs basically to define the parts of UX design that I'll give a little credit to that we've done a decent job with. Now this is your transitions, this is blink teleporting, this is motion, this is UI that doesn't frighten you to death because it becomes visible with a set of animations instead of just popping up as a cube in your face. Like these are basic lessons that at least are becoming common enough that we're skipping that iterative process that I described where a UX designer can walk in, understand these base lessons, and it's carried through quite a few applications at this point. Input and information UX is a very different story. Display of information, UX drill down patterns, UX flows, the concept of a user story, given the bounds of your experience right now, are so off the wall, and there's quite a bit of dogma involved in a lot of the approaches that I see today and the way they're sold, which makes sense from that perspective. But if we can get past believing that we're mature in that area, I think we'll start to get to the point to where we provide a more functional XR experience than a design process that just is trying to get to step 2 and not take into consideration a brand new environment. Collaborative human UX is an awesome nightmare for anyone who's playing with that right now. So in Unity's Editor 3D or Editor VR, we can jump in with multiple individuals with multiple riffs and vibes, mix and match if you want, and cause each other a whole bunch of pain, which is super awesome because you can pull up different workspaces and content creation tools, and you can have multiple people trying to grab someone's toolbox, and they're trying to trigger a UI event, and while another person's attempting to scale one of the windows and place something there. I won't even go into the fun of the challenges that we'll approach there. But the fact that we finally have that environment where 2 people can jump into this situation and introduce a UX paradigm that we've never had to conceive. I mean, multiple fingers on a touchpad is one thing. 2 people in an environment with different controllers on the same screen, controlling different parts of a tank is another thing. Brand new situation. Super fun, super horrible challenges. So, so 6 degrees of freedom, obviously, rotation, and your lateral and your vertical movement there. It's better. It's usable. I think we're at the point where UX designers can begin to design for scenarios that allow them to express themselves to a decent degree at this point. When I think of XR UX, I usually analogize it in the perspective of you're the poet attempting to write this, convey this beautiful message, and you're crippled in a multitude of ways for every single device that you're going to, and every UI change that goes from a device that can have a controller or doesn't have a controller, or has a touch button, or the touch button does a thing when you're using the controller, or you don't have this much degree of freedom with a certain device, or you've got a complete field of view. So it's an interesting set of challenges, but it's a fun set of challenges that if you can begin to learn from the process, and you can learn and anticipate what will happen when you go from device to device, given that change in hardware, it empowers you as a UX designer like nothing else can. Again, the dogma of believing that there's just this device I developed for, there's just this paradigm, as was said in the beginning of this talk, is going to hurt you in the long run, because as soon as a new one of these is introduced, best of luck anticipating that. The UX designer that wants to stay on top of their toes and be able to be relevant is the UX designer that when this device comes, and we can all read up on the papers on what will come eventually, but some of this is coming fairly recently, the individual that knows in advance to do this design. Somehow I need to slow time to get to the rest of this. So, we'll hit the rest of that some other time. So, context-sensitive UX design, again, highly device dependent. The challenges and the issues that face UX designers right now, as I said, it's just entertaining beyond belief, especially when from device generation to device generation, the input scheme or the hardware actually changes while you're doing that design. Totally fair for you. So ergonomics and usability, accessibility, that area is becoming fairly standardized. I mean, there are quite a few lessons we can learn from this. One that I'm not seeing enough is that users actually get tired. You need to start thinking about this. There is an issue to where, I know in my own medium sessions, grabbing that chair at a certain point, it's not a bad thing, especially after hour 3 or so. So, 3DOF, again, rotation, no positional moving, 6DOF, full rotation positioning, sitting, standing, room scale, N number of options that the UX designer has to, again, go, what's my user story? What's the scenario? What are the set of analytics or events, or if I don't even have that access, things I'm going to anticipate to be able to craft a fluid, cohesive UX design pattern that allows someone to be sitting and then swapping a controller and swapping hands and grabbing this. And again, the pain of one day, someone jumping into your experience and deciding to take your hammer away from you. So it's going to be a fun one. Information clutter, I touched on it earlier. I'd like to embellish quite a bit more, but super key thing with design when it relates to actual UI-based design and interaction. The paradigm of 2D planes and being able to pound as much information as you possibly can at a user, please experiment with other options. Please try to define a language and explore a language that will allow you to get to the end result and the content you need without that level of verbose display of content. Because the saturation when you're in 3D, saturation where your menus and your content, outside of scenarios like Medium, for example, I mean, it will be everywhere. It will be around you, and you know, in your day-to-day, you know, when you're trying to focus on a single item and there are a million things running around you, like, let's be empathetic to the user with our design. Let's try to hide things. When a gaze isn't looking at something, maybe it goes semi-transparent. You know, when the dot or the cross isn't pointing at something, well, then maybe there's no context for that UI event, and there shouldn't be a UI event in that case. In a future talk or some other situation, I'd love to go into many of the lessons learned in Editor VR along those lines. It's very minute, very detailed in that area, but the challenges there are very, very valuable to go over. Occlusion and reachability, also spoken to by Brian there. The most interesting thing is when you pop up a menu, decide to place it here, pull an object in front of your content, and then, oh, hey, your raycast doesn't allow you to get to your menu. All of a sudden, UX design for that type of empathetic approach for the user needs to consider, well, is there a context for if my menu is behind here? My user needs to be able to get to the content, that then do I have context for disabling something in between, at least a collider, still reaching the item if there's, say, a duration of time, a secondary button, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see here. We can skip that. Key thing on the bottom there, too. There's still a lot of this going on, which is fine. It doesn't need to be there. Think about the degrees of freedom that you're being allotted right now. Think about what happens when, if I wanted to trigger a menu, and I wanted to get content off this menu off of my hand, instead of having to take a hand and aim a hand at the object, consider what happens if you can now just click a button on here or do a gesture. You can cycle through options and let go. You've accomplished the same action. Using haptics, you actually never need to see your hand in that case. And you can have the individual who's quite skilled in this area pop out their tool, cycle 3 forward, let go, and then they're doing their thing. Or if they're doing fine detail, pull up the tool, go back a quarter of an inch, and then just get right back to using the exact same thing. This type of design, when you take into account gesture and rotation as well, begins to eliminate the paradigm we're used to with point and click and touch and hunt and drag and all these things like this. Those 6 degrees of freedom provide a situation for UX design we've never had. Yes, you need to introduce it. Yes, we need to build out this language. But as I'll touch on a little bit later, if we define this language, the OSs that will be defining our XR future, our glasses, our everything else, I'm not sure if you saw the pattern that was followed with Oculus. We will be able to carve out that area of the API as UX, XR designers, and keep that for ourselves to a degree. The more experimentation you do, and the more you establish with your applications for these XR OSs that will end up replacing most of our devices, the more you exercise it, the more we all get to play with. So the less of traditional design you're doing, and the more established your app comes, the more of the position you're in for everyone here to be able to say that that gesture, whatever you did there that did that thing, we all get that. So test your boundaries. Make the app that establishes yourself to that degree, so that when we're all wearing it on our face or contact lenses in 25 years or something, that's something we all get to still use, and the OS doesn't get to capitalize. Really key point there that I don't see brought up enough. So the 3 main areas that I'm going to breeze through as quickly as possible. There are many more in UX design, but these 3 are definitely the areas where I'm almost always having the same discussions, going over the same set of questions, seeing the same iteration in a program as it goes from Gen 1 XR to Gen 50 by the time it ends up seeing the consumer audience. So again, visuals, motion, transitions, comfort, and emotion. You can't pop things in. You've got to use empathy. You've got to care about the user more than you ever have had to. Something just popping into view, something not giving a UX hint as to where it started, where it ended. It doesn't mean you go overboard with flair, but not guiding the user. We've got all this space. And then to make the assumption that the thing you'll be doing will only be here is to say there isn't also another thing that's already here, or 6 things that are here, so that your thing will need to go over here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So consider how it is you can introduce the user to their story without needing to be in a position where you force situations on the user. That in this experience, I mean, you can bring someone to nausea with very little effort. I'm sure any XR UX designer in here has been able to do that. Not cool, not entertaining, but also not what you want in your design. So think about that. Motion nausea, passe. It's pretty traditional now. Ergonomics, usability, accessibility, again, keep this in mind. Keep in mind what it means to do the same thing 200 times. Keep in mind your user story that sets up a pattern of events, a set of changes during your application process with the user that will be a smoother one if you take into account all 10 steps. It doesn't mean you bias your choices for that, but it does mean that we now have a situation where instead of click, 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 drag, click, move left and right, we now have, I need to move my arm over here, there's another thing I need to do, there's a two-handed action that needs to occur, I need to be able to save something and then proceed. These user stories are all brand new. So when you're expanding out your perspective on traditional 2D linear timeline-based UX design, think about this process. Because an individual that, kind of analogize it to the complex domain in mathematics, if you can pull yourself out from that linear timeline and start to think about how it is you can reconcile n number of choices and do that design, completely different paradigm that very few people are touching on, but when it's executed on, it's some of the most satisfying XR experiences for a UX designer I've ever seen done right. Let's see. Yeah, so it's this area maturing pretty well. I mean, very, very well compared to the other areas. Thankfully, I mean, it's the limitation plus the benefits of the fact that the devices we're using today, quite a bit of what they do with just a display on your eyes, and they have a linear, projected experience on your eyes, that this will carry through to AR, this will carry through MR, XR, et cetera, et cetera. Cool benefit is the cross-app experiential UX is taking a lot of the load off. A lot of these actually are, I would argue, becoming conventions. I mean, you don't intentionally try to make the user vomit by, say, locomoting like you're playing Doom or something. Like, these are standard conventions, 101 type of stuff, do a Google search, just avoid them, learn from them, unless you have the most innovative new approach, and please share it if you do. Like, these just get the job done, and they allow you to get that to that next level of UX design without having to toil over the same things that we are all and have all done 100 times over. Pardon me, out of brevity, I'm going to have to skip more here. 3 minutes, going to have to skip a whole lot here. Let me pick out the better ones here. Session length, as I mentioned, big thing. I love it when I see development hit the point to where they're at almost release stage, and then it's like, we're getting user feedback that they can't use the app anymore at this point because they're that tired. Like that, we've never had to care about that to a great degree at this point. And this is one of the first situations where a designer who cares can craft a situation that maybe the situation changes in contours, becomes a situation that allows for the user to be able to go into that mode, instead of strictly saying that I'm doing a walking, I'm doing a sitting, I'm doing an X type of situation there. Input modifiers is super awesome stuff. I touched on that, but can't embellish at this point with the time. Keep going forward. Information design is a minefield. I would love to touch on this. Feel free to take a picture. I'm running out of time very quickly. This is a super troublesome area. The wheel's getting reinvented so often in this area where I want to be in the matrix and I want to see a bunch of lines pop up and content pop up and a million text objects, and they all need to have a button, and there are 50 of them on top of each other, and when you go to touch them, they move. And look at what's going on right now in the market. Play as many experiences as you possibly can, and please help us all innovate. Share your creations. We need to be able to convey quite a bit of information. We can't, unfortunately, relegate ourselves to speech at this point to be able to handle all of that. We don't have EEG mind control at this point, so please, let's all innovate something that can save us in this area. All right, so fairly quickly, I'll try not to go too far over here. Perhaps ending up at the most important point here. So robust inside-out tracking. Long story short, if anyone's not familiar, devices that don't need trackers around your room, you'll be able to put on your Gear VR, actually get tracking in your space. You'll get the degrees of freedom that are required to begin to actually introduce to a UX designer the situation that they deserve, basically. I think developing for Gear VR is an interesting challenge, and you can do great things with it, but being the UX designer who is hindered to that degree is a challenge that, you can't wait to get out of at a certain point there. Wonderful market, great establishing perspective, but consider where we're going. Mental UX, not covered at all, almost, but is absolutely amazing. If you haven't tried the emotive epic yet, and you haven't tried the epic in an XR situation, it's mind-blowing. Being able to sit down and skip gestures and anything I'm talking about along these lines, but being able to think a tool swap and then in medium your tool swaps, that's a brand new thing. And understanding that these devices are at least coming with the capacity to where if they make this choice, and this is an area in the infantile process right now, but if you can focus on what we're opening up with the Epic, this is a brand new paradigm that, if we can establish it as a market, is absolutely wonderful for designers. Being able to, at least in a low resolution format, be able to gauge after entrainment what the user's actually thinking and apply that to UX frees you from so many cumbersome layers of UX design and what it is we actually have to implement in this type of domain. Yeah, less visible UI, please. Just anytime you can save any of us from that. Yeah, 1.5 million buttons, no. More emphasis on 4D space. Again, everyone's still stuck in billboard land. Everything has to be 2D. I get it. It gets the job done. There are different paradigms. Hit your button, pop up, menu comes up, drag through, and you cycle through 10 different menus and settle on the one. Again, it's same space, one button, use depth, change context. Motion aesthetics we already hit there. The OS level, multi-scenario. Again, OSs will cannibalize the API that you don't end up owning. So please be that app that carves out that API that we all get to benefit from. Don't just stick to convention. Make a big thing happen. Experiment. Be willing to fail, but get that API for all of us. Yeah, we get down the rest later. Distant, the sad part. We're all replaceable. There's that. And let's just be thankful that AIs can't refactor themselves, because then none of us would be in this room. So leading up to that point with deep learning and machine learning, et cetera, to romanticize the inability for algorithms to reproduce a decent degree of what we're all doing, engineers, designers, artists, et cetera, humans, we'll leave you out in the dust at a certain point. So be ahead of that and understand that if you can embrace this potentially unfortunate but awesome reality, you can be one of the designers that can keep this in mind and understand that you have the chance to be positioning yourself as more of a design curator or DJ of sorts when this paradigm begins to hit a bit more. To be at least semi-aware and do some research on some of what's going on in the industry now in this area, I think empowers you to be a designer that doesn't have this core set of skills that you were anchored to just, disappear to a degree at a certain day. And again, that's coming from an engineer that I won't be surprised when engineering goes bye-bye real soon. So, context-aware design, another thing that I see happen very little, and in an app that gets to relegate its environment to a set design pattern and a set of content, you have to worry less about this. But as we begin to design for XR, and you'll have apps that interact and exist in your life, begin to understand what happens when context changes. Begin to understand that there at least is discussion on APIs that will handle some of these types of changes, and I hope much more of that comes up. But how will you design when you are competing with another app? How will you design when there are 3 other things going on in this situation? If you're able to get cues of a certain sort from another app, be they volume, be it motion, be it whatever it is, color, do you choose an analogous versus a complementary color? Do you go with a slower set of motions if there's something else that's very fast that's distracting the user? As we begin to have a multi-app environment with an XR, what will probably hit us first, set of glasses, this will be something that the designer who can contemplate this will be super empowered in this area to have, is to understand that your walled garden is gone the second that this comes. As if you think that if we're demonstrating this on our phones, is anyone using just one app today? I mean, is anyone using split screen or multi-screen mode? You're getting notifications from 3 or 4 others. Think about this paradigm. And when it's breached, think about how you'll handle it, which is an interesting one, because again, we get to own some of the API if we consider what happens if there's something that changes to the degree here that our UX paradigm would have to shift in this case. Apologize, I'll make the next minute or 2 worth it, sorry. So consumer customization, there's almost 0 discussion about this. This, again, is going to hit hard as soon as these devices come. To believe that users won't have the ability to move their apps around, change their background, et cetera, et cetera. I hear next to no discussion about this until some of the apps that we end up working with or devs we were speaking with begin to allow this customization, and it breaks out of the walled garden. You can't control the colors, you can't control the shape and the context in that sense. So I'd say just begin thinking about that pattern, because there are so many problems to solve in that area. touched on cross-product shared user UX aesthetics. That's going to be, these common things that the OS will probably own and pass throughout. It's beginning to be established right now through the Rift, the Vive, and the Gear, so it's worth looking into and understanding the commonalities that you can begin to piggyback on here. And kind of existential, but think about the long run of what's going to go on here. When it's not 150 times a day for almost all of us, I believe the human average for accessing your cell phone each day, it's the 24/7, it defines your reality situation. Understand you get to play the role, you get to be part of playing the role to sculpt human interaction, social interaction, aesthetics, emotion. That's up to you. This is going to be more empowering than any other paradigm we've had. This is the usual spiel. I'm not trying to sell you anything, but when this hits, think about what you're going to be empowered with. Think about your design today as it leads up into a scenario to where if you're doing a VR app today, and myself, I am personally, and I'm working with devs, they're considering the AR implementation now. They're considering the post-AR implementation right now. So as you're doing that design, you're designing for an AR app today if you're designing for the Rift, if you're designing for the Gear. Think about that while you're doing this scenario. It'll cost you less pain in the end when you actually have to deal with this change, and it'll empower your decisions and maybe land you a few patents along the way if you contemplate this. Nah, we don't have time. Anyway, thank you very much. Oops.